everyone. Thank you.
So just to ease everybody in, I'll give a quick introduction, but who better than the woman herself to introduce us to today?
Yes, my name is Holly Bourne, and I write both books for teenagers and books for adults. I always have to be careful to not say adult books, because then people think you write porn, which is not what I do. And I write commercial fiction that I hope helps my readers feel kind of seen and understood, and mostly about women's issues. So I've written about things like obsessive compulsive disorder, sort of coercive controlling relationships, the pressures on women when they hit 30 to get married and have children. And yeah, I kind of really believe in the power of stories to kind of make the world a better place and make everyone feel happier and healthier in themselves. So that's sort of, yeah, why I write.
Amazing. And I'm sure, like many people in the audience, I've read your books and I'm a huge fan. But before your extensive and acclaimed career as an author, you're a journalist. How was this experience for you?
Being a journalist, I learned quite soon on when I was a news journalist that you shouldn't be a news journalist if you're a highly empathetic person. It's not a job for empaths. And I graduated from the University of Sheffield with a degree in journalism, and it was kind of, at the time, the known route to kind of getting into working in the media was you start in local journalism, and this was sort of when local journalism was still something that people really took seriously, and most families would go and buy the weekly paper, and this was kind of before print was dying. And so that's what I went out to do, because I was like, I need to earn my stripes. And I was in a really quiet patch. It was in Surrey, and I was like, oh, this is going to be easy. It's just going to be, children falling over in the playground or cats getting rescued from trees. And actually, I realised quite soon there's darkness in any community, and it was my job to find it. And I found it really upsetting, all the sort of darkness I found, because I think when you're a news journalist, you are dealing with the worst day of somebody's life every day, sometimes multiple times a day. There'd be like some horrible story about a boy dying on a railway track, and then there'd be something else that had gone wrong at the local hospital, and then there'd been a fire in a hotel, and that could sometimes just be like your Tuesday. And I do really believe in the power of the free press and democracy, and particularly local papers, I think, play a really important part in democracy, because they're kind of holding the local councils to account for stuff that really you notice in life, like potholes and when your bins get collected and that sort of, those sorts of things. But I just got very sad and upset doing that job. And I think because people that I was trying to interview could sense that I was quite a caring person, could sense that I didn't feel quite right doing what I was doing, it meant that I was more likely to get the interview, and so I kind of was good at doing this thing that made me feel really uncomfortable. So I started writing a book, my first novel, like around these 50-hour shifts, just as a kind of release for my brain. And then I quit my job and went travelling, which is what you do, I think, when you're 24 and you're like, I don't know what to do, I'll just go see the world, it's something to do. And when I was travelling, I realised I really wanted to finish that novel that I started. And so when I came back, I got a job 3 days a week working for a youth charity as a journalist. And it was like good journalism, because I was writing about issues that help young people and using words and journalism to make people feel better about themselves rather than to kind of exploit their pain for sales. And then I did 2 days a week, was kind of committed to finishing my first novel, and I was very lucky that my first ever novel got published. It was called Soulmates. It was a kind of satire takedown of all the sort of dark romance Twilight books that were doing the rounds at the time. And and then I spent 5 years writing books for teenagers alongside working at the charity, and I think getting to work with young people all day, every day, and being in this incredibly privileged position where they talk to me about their problems really helped me work out what I wanted to write, which was books that might make them feel better about the stuff that they were going through, and books that might make them feel less alone. Because if you've got lots of young people telling you they think there's something wrong with them, and what's wrong with them is, I don't know, they have obsessive compulsive disorder, you see that how normal that is, or how usual that is, and how they're not the only one. And so I was like, if I could write a book that make them realise that there's so many other young people out there in the world that struggle with this. I think that would be really helpful, and that sort of helped frame the book that I think was like my breakout book in my career, which was called Am I Normal Yet?, which was about a girl called Evie who had obsessive compulsive disorder. So that's sort of, how my career came about. And I've been doing it for a long time now.
Well, I'm grateful that you've been doing it for a long time, because it's meant that I had lots to read as growing up, and your first adult novel as well, which was like a nice transition for myself, and I'm sure many others. So you kind of already answered a question that I had about what inspired this change from going to a journalist to being then an author. How, or why, I suppose, what made you write as your outlet to journalism? Was it because you had been in a job where you're writing and creatively writing instead was an outlet? Was that the link?
Yeah, I think writing journalism, like it is a craft, and it's, you kind of learn the news pyramid, which is, how to structure a story to get the information that the reader most needs to know as quickly as possible. And it's called, you got to get the what, where, why, where, oh my God. What, when, where, why, who in there. And there's huge craftsmanship in being a news journalist, and regardless of what you think of their politics. I always, sometimes if I see it on the train, if I see a copy of like the Sun newspaper, I always pick it up, and I'm always so impressed with that craftsmanship, because apparently the story that people say is that if you go into the Sun offices, there's a big poster that says nobody reads the second paragraph. And the power that you can usually just read the top half of any of the stories in the Sun, and you know what's happened, and that's incredible. But it's also, there's a formula to it, and sometimes you're writing about politics that you don't agree with, or covering things that make you really sad, or invading somebody's privacy, and writing a novel was just so different. And you're writing about stuff that hadn't happened, so nobody's feelings could get hurt. You could describe stuff. You didn't, especially if my book Soulmates kind of defied some laws of physics, you could be quite fantastical. And as I said, it was so different from my day-to-day job that I just kind of hid in novel writing as a way of like de-stressing. And then when I finally wrote the words at the end, I was like, what do I do now? I guess I might try and get it published, but the thought of getting published seemed so insane to somebody like me who didn't know anyone in the publishing industry, and nobody I'd ever known had ever got anything published. It was a bit like wanting to be an astronaut or a prima ballerina, but I researched how to get a book published and applied to my literary agent, and straight away she said, I want to offer you representation. I was like, excuse me, really? And then, I went on submission and I got my publisher, and I've just been allowed to write books ever since. And turning that escape and that hobby into a career has been one of the most incredible things that's ever happened to me. I still feel like, I'm an astronaut or a footballer or a prima ballerina, but it's also strange when you start having to monetize your creativity, or market forces make you think, should I write that or should I not? And so it's changed my hobby, and I've been saying a lot for a long time now, I need a hobby now that writing has become my job. I need to take up oil painting or bouldering or something, so that I have that place of escape, because I don't have that anymore.
So do you feel constrained sometimes by the need to write, because it's become so, in a way, commercialized? It's your job. Do you feel like you need another release from that release?
I think so, because I think, because I'm a commercial writer, which is, I basically write books that are easy to read, which are hard to write. It's really hard to write things that are easy to read. There's like a lot of craftsmanship and knowledge and understanding, and like I get my kicks out of reading books that tell me how the eyeball reads text and how many, like, the ideal amount of words per sentence. I really, I am always thinking of the reader. Now that I'm in this incredibly privileged position where I have publishing contracts, and I will say to my publisher, I want to write about this, and I'll be like, okay, and I'm allowed to write about it, but I'm thinking, this is going to get read. So people are going to read this, and I've always got that reader in mind, and that's so different from I'm writing for me, and you do write differently, and I think you write more conservatively. I think you worry about offending people, you worry about being censored, because especially if you write for teenagers, you've got to be careful that you don't upset booksellers, or you don't upset librarians or school librarians, so you can't go too dark sometimes. And it was really interesting. I became a mother for the first time 2 years ago, and that's a very overwhelming experience, like becoming pregnant and growing a baby and giving birth and having to look after it. And I don't think anything can ever prepare you for what an overwhelming experience it was. And what I found quite magical is I was this sleep-deprived mess, and you barely get a chance to wash in those early like hours and stuff. And what I found so weird is if I got a moment to myself, I didn't sleep, or I didn't wash, or I would be really quick. I would go to my laptop and I would write a diary of trying to capture this feeling. And I remember at one point I was like, I wonder how long this is, and it was 50,000 words long. And my agent was like, great, you should publish it. I'm like, I don't want anyone to ever read this, because it was so raw. And also, I think there's so many conversations to be had about writing about your kids, or the experience of having your kids, because when they grow up, they might read it, and then that would... and I was like, this is 50,000 words that nobody is ever going to read. And I still wrote it, and it was so important to me, and I still update it here and now. And so it was a nice reminder that I am a writer, and I always will be, and it's how I make sense of the world, and it's nice to not have that commercial slant to it all the time. But of course, you've also then got your mortgage to pay.
Just previously, you said before how, becoming an author is like becoming a prima ballerina or an astronaut or something that can often seem very unattainable. But what is some advice you'd have for an aspiring author who'd want to get into the industry, or maybe something you wish you had known before you got involved?
It is a meritocracy. Publishing is, and so many people think it isn't, and it is. I mean, obviously there is nepotism. Obviously, luckily for you guys, lots of people in publishing went to Oxbridge. So you guys, there is those cliques and those circles that help, but unless you're famous or a podcaster or whatever, they're not going to publish your book if it's crap. They're just not. And agents and publishers are looking for a good book that sells, that connects with people. And my agent, it's called the slush pile. I think that's what they call unsolicited manuscripts that get sent to literary agents. And it's just people who wrote a book. And she reads every single one. She tells me she gets up to 90 a day. And she reads them all, because she's like, well, it could be the next best thing. And since I've got published, it's weird, like lots of people come out of the woodwork from your past, like people off my uni course are like, hi, Holly. Hey, we had such a great time. I'm like, you never spoke to me. And they're like, I want to write a book. And I was wondering if you could get me in touch. And I realised, people think that I can help them get a publishing deal. And I can't. Because it really will depend on how good your book is, and also whether or not you've submitted the book to the right agent with the similar taste from you, and where the market is. There are those forces as well, but it really is just about writing the book and then just going through the process, and anyone can do it. And I've met so many authors through my career who have come to being an author through so many different backgrounds, and the only difference between us and unpublished people is we wrote the book, and we worked on making it the best book that it could be. And so many people who come up to me who be like, I want to be published, I want to be a writer. The first thing I always ask them is, well, have you written a book? No, but, and I'm like, no. have you written a book? Have you done that to yourself? Because it's hardcore writing a novel. It's like this mental marathon with yourself. And it requires hours and hours of solitude, and you feel like you're going slightly mad because you're basically hallucinating in your pajamas and writing it down. You get bored of your idea after about the first 30,000 words, or you get a new idea that you think is better. You get really demoralised because as you're writing the book, you realise that you're just ruining this idea in your head, and you're like, oh, it's so good, and this is just terrible, and yet you just keep going, and you keep going, and you keep going until you've got a finished manuscript. And then you don't send it off, you edit it, you know, your first draft is going to be terrible. It always is. And that, you go back to it again and again, and you make the characters better, and you take out that scene that's not working, and you just, it's all about, I want to tell the best story that I can tell, and I'm going to do it. And only then do you come to me and ask me how to get published. And then it'll be like, you know, okay. But so many people don't reach the end, and they want the thing, and I'm like, but you've got to create the product before you can take it to market. And yeah, so my advice is always is finish the book. You can't get published unless you've finished the book, unless you're famous, and then you can write a chapter and people will give you £100,000, you know, to write a book about party planning or whatever. But you know, for most of us, it's about completion and polishing, and the self-belief and the determination and the sacrifices you have to make in life to finish a novel.
I suppose in that way it's almost like Dragon's Den, where you go with your finished product. But I don't think that's helpful, is you have to have the product there for them to want it before you pitch yourself. Because it's your talent that they're writing, they're going to choose. But you said just before that it's about getting the best story that you can write. How have you decided what's the best story for you personally to write? Like, what topics to choose?
I think it's how a writer decides what to write is so personal, and everyone, again, has their own different process. So I always like to preface these questions with going, this is what works for me. It will be different for you. So I normally have stumbled onto a book idea I found, and I always stumble onto book ideas. They're never... My process is never something I can recreate, and so I'm always in a constant panic that I'll never get another idea for a book, and I'm like, what if I run out of ideas because I don't know how I do this? But the pattern that I've noticed is if I'm having a strong emotional response to something in life, if I'm either very angry or very sad or a bit bewildered or confused and I want to talk to somebody about it, I'm like, have you seen what's going on with this? Do you feel this way? That's usually a book. So I'll talk you through some different examples, but again, they're all really varied. So my last book that I wrote for teenagers is called You Could Be So Pretty, and it's sort of a dystopic, with a twist, exploration of beauty standards and the kind of impossible beauty standards that girls are currently living with. I got the idea from that Billie Eilish Vogue cover. I don't know if you guys remember it, but I think it was during COVID. She put herself in a corset and dyed her hair blonde. And she's obviously somebody who's always very famously rejected beauty standards and not wanted to show off her body, because she's like, I don't want you to know what my body looks like. It's irrelevant to my craft and my art and everything that I stand for. And then she dyed her hair blonde, put a corset on, and the cover line was, it's about what makes you feel good. And my timeline exploded, and I'm quite a feminist person, so I've got lots of friends who are feminists, and it was such a three-way split in how people were responding to that cover. Like, a third of my friends were going, she looks so beautiful, it's amazing, I actually feel emotional about this, like, I'm so glad that she's done this and found that she can be pretty too. And I was like, I feel a bit weird about that. Do I agree? I'm not sure. And then a third of my friends were like, she's a disgrace, she's a traitor, this is awful, who coerced her into doing this, this is so sad that she's fallen for this pressure, and a corset's a symbolic, you know, garments of oppression, like, and a third of people were going, we shouldn't even be having this conversation, she could do whatever the hell she wants. Like, we're objectifying her just by having this conversation. Like, she has this choice, this is weird. And I just felt, I don't. And it took me 90,000 words to write a novel to figure out how I feel about that. And that's why I was like, there's something going on here about if you can't just dye your hair blonde and wear a slightly restrictive piece of clothing without everyone exploding, there's something going on. And so that was how I got the idea for that book. But another book that I wrote, The Places I've Cried in Public, which is about an emotionally abusive relationship. And it's about a girl who didn't realise she's been in an emotionally abusive relationship. And she's broken up with this guy. She feels quite broken by the relationship. And so she goes back to all the places that relationship's made her cry and kind of relives what happened. And through that journey, she starts realising maybe things were darker. And I got the idea, again, I was having an emotional response to the world where it was during the 2016 train strikes, which if you lived in the southeast were like a really gnarly time to try and get from A to B. And I think I had to wait for 2 hours at platform 13 of Clapham Junction train station. And I think I had realised at the time that I was about to have to make some really, really hard decisions about my life that I knew I needed to make and I would come out the other side of, but I knew that the result, the thing that I'd have to get through would be hell on earth. And I just really wanted to get on a train home and cry, but the trains kept being delayed and it was freezing cold and I just couldn't hold it anymore. And I just started crying at platform check. I still sometimes go past the bench on the train, I'm like, oh. And then I started thinking about publicly crying. And I remember asking people on Twitter, like, have you ever cried publicly? And these stories started pouring in and people, like so many, and it was always women and girls, had a place. Oh, it was this train, it was this airport, or it was this picnic bench, or it was this, and somebody had a story, and it just got me into this really obsessive idea, into this idea of psychogeography, which is the idea that there could just be one bench outside on the quad, and this amount of things that have happened on that bench, and people, it might be somebody got proposed, or somebody got broken up with, or somebody fell apart that day, or somebody got a job offer, and how we just have these shadows and imprints of time, and that's, yeah. So I was crying my eyes out at Clapham Junction, and that gave me the idea for crying in public and why it's such a female behaviour, and how there's something about crying publicly that really leaves a stain in our memory. You really remember the places where you cried in public. And so, yeah, that, as I said, I've learned to kind of take my broken heart or my confused heart or my angry heart and turn it into art. And that's what works for me. But I'm not suggesting you all need to go out and have sort of mental breakdowns in order to create. Like, you might have healthier methods of inspiration, but that's how I get book ideas. So happiness is always a worry. It's very uninspiring.
Obviously, you've discussed mental health in your books a lot. Obviously inspired by different experiences of crying in public. But how is, when you're writing about things like obsessive compulsive disorder, how is your research around that, and how does that help your writing? And do you struggle thinking how relatable it is going to be, or do you think that obviously you're writing about one specific character and their experience?
I think, because when I worked at the youth charity, I started as a junior journalist, and by the time I left, I was head of content. And it was a charity that helped all young people with almost all their problems. That was our ethos, was any problem that you can possibly imagine having between the ages of 16 and 25. We wanted to be able to help you with that, and we were trained professional journalists who would write advice content. But almost inevitably, the things that came up over and over again were sex and relationship problems, because that's obviously a very preoccupying thing for young people, and mental health issues was just day in, day out. Teenagers whose brains are just, causing them so much hardship. And one of the processes I went through before I left that charity is it was my job to reshape and rebuild our editorial policy on mental illness, and kind of be like, as an entire charity, how do we want to approach how we write about mental illness? So then I was in this incredible position where I was just going to seminars, workshops, conferences with like the world leading experts of how to make people feel better and how to understand mental illness, and that was transformative for me personally, someone with a brain who isn't always as nice to me as I'd like it to be, but also, I felt like I was really there when the conversation was changing about how we see mental health and mental health problems, which is we're moving more and more away from this diagnostic criteria. People are diagnoses. I am bipolar. I am anorexic. I am an obsessive compulsive. I am a depressive. And people seeing these labels. And what's been happening with all the research that's coming out with how to help people is to move away from this idea that mental illness is just something that's going wrong in you, or something that's wrong with you, something that's likely to be wrong with you forever, and to more take a kind of stand back and ask the question to anyone who suffers, what happened to you? and try and understand mental illness from a socioeconomic perspective, from a perspective of sexism, from a psychological, from a psychiatrical, from a biological. And it's basically like anyone who has a brain that malfunctions or has coping strategies that make them unhappy, if you look at their life story of what happened to them, what was their childhood like, have they been exposed to trauma, what's their history of illness, what hardships did their parents have, how much love did they have in their home, were they exposed to abuse and trauma, anybody's mental illness will make complete sense. And I think that contextualization is everything and can set so many people free. And I think that's when I write about mental health. So Evie with her OCD, or I wrote a book called Are We All Lemmings and Snowflakes, which is all about this, like me trying to get teenagers to learn what I've learned. So Olive in Are We All Lemmings and Snowflakes suffers from what we know is like bipolar disorder, and that whole book is all about her working out why that is. I think that's really informs how I write about it, because I do think once you've had these conversations or heard somebody say this, it's not about what's wrong with you, it's about what happened to you. Everything starts to fall into place, and having a more trauma-informed understanding of mental illness, I think, is the most exciting thing that's happened in mental illness in like the last 30, 40 years, like trauma-informed understanding rather than maybe you don't have enough serotonin, or maybe it's hereditary, or all this sort of stuff. And so again, that was my day job, informing my writing. And then when I'm writing a character who has a mental health problem, obviously I'll research OCD and I'll interview young people who have OCD and that, but then I stop and I'm like, and now it's about the story, and now it's about this character. What else is going on? Because nobody is ever their mental health problem. They're funny, or they're a good friend, or they're a good sister, or they love film, or they love photography. I'm like, okay, research to stop. Who is this person, and what's their story? And I kind of just let it go and just get into the storytelling of it. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, I much appreciate it. I think it's very liberating as well. It's like you're not just what's happened to you, like you're much more than that. And reading it in a young adult book, especially at that age, when things are happening to you, like your body's changing, everything's going on, there's people around you, and it helps you to support people at the same time. So thank you so much for telling these stories that are so important. So you mentioned that you're working with charities and that you were helping with sex and relationships. Did this affect the way you viewed the world, but also the way did it affect the way you saw yourself and your own relationships?
When I was head of content, but I also trained to be a relationship advisor when I was at the charity. And I worked on this service where young people could ask any question about sex or relationships, and we would reply. It was anonymous, so people felt very free to tell me their deepest, darkest penis measurements, hidden, STIs, being in love with your teacher, all the stuff that I've seen it a million times. And I did 2 shifts a week at that job. And I'm just to warn anyone, I'm going to talk very briefly about sexual violence here. So if that's going to be hard, do just leave. It's fine. I want everyone in this room to be safe. But what I quickly found out when I was doing this job was it was a rape crisis service. And basically, it was worse than that. It was a rape crisis service for girls who didn't realise they had been raped. And this was happening every shift, all day, every shift. A girl would write into me to explain and describe what was almost always a rape, almost always with somebody they're in a relationship with. And then I'd feel a bit weird, or should I be angry, or no, I don't know what to do, or might I be pregnant? And they just didn't realise. And it was awful. And when you just see that all day, every day, it really takes a toll on you. And we had compulsory clinical psychotherapy as part of the job, because obviously in order to respond to these people, you have to be in a good place yourself. And I remember right at the start, my therapist said, nobody really can do this job for more than 2 years. Everyone burns out. But, let's see how you do. And I was like, oh. And yeah, within 2 years, I was like, I can't do this job anymore. And I'm aware this is being filmed and might go online, and I'm scared like what the comments are underneath, because it made me hate men. That job made me hate men, and part of the psychotherapy was me going, I don't want to. But the way that she described it was like, well, if you worked for, I don't know, a charity for victims of dog bites, and all day, every day, you're having people, whose arms were missing. Well, I don't know if a dog can do that, but you'd start to really, whenever you saw a dog on the street, be like, and yeah, so within 2 years I stopped, and just because I couldn't do it anymore, and I couldn't unsee what I knew, which is this epidemic, and I'm not using that word lightly, especially not after COVID, the epidemic of the normalisation of sexual violence in girls in intimate relationships or with people that they know. And it's just happening everywhere, all the time. And the lasting legacy and trauma of that, and how so many girls, because it's so normal, don't realise that it was that until sometimes 5, 10, 20, 50 years later. And I couldn't be on the front line anymore. Again, I'm an empath. It took its toll. So I was like, I want to write about it. And that's also what helped inform the places I cried in public. And then I also became an ambassador for Women's Aid. Because so many of these things happen in relationships, again, we always think sexual violence is stereotypically happened to somebody who drank too much, wearing a short skirt, and is in an alleyway in there, that, therefore they deserve, or whatever, but that complete nonsense. But it's almost always in a relationship. Like, whenever I'm walking home from a train station late, my husband's like, be careful. And I'm like, I'm most at risk with you. Like, the most unsafe I am is when I close the door and I'm in our bedroom. And he's like, stop saying that. And I'm like, statistically, I'm like fine out on the streets, probably. You're the person most likely to kill me, statistically, you. And he's like, I'm like, this is what happens if you marry a feminist. I'm going to bring these things out. And that, yeah, being an ambassador for Women's Aid, and I'm ambassador for the Love Respect service, which is a website that helps young people understand abusive relationships and understand sort of sexual violence. That's been a really nourishing thing to do, to kind of help me feel like I'm stopping it, even though it's a giant tidal wave. And I think all my books to some degree deal with that, because again, sadly, most girls will be able to relate to it, and hopefully my books will help them understand that weird thing that they feel confused about.
I think definitely. It even helps people if they go through it in future, and having that pretext as to what it was, which is incredibly vital work that you've done throughout your novels and what you're doing with Women's Aid. Just on Women's Aid, how did you get into that, and has it been difficult in ways similarly to your, like, as a columnist? How has it been working there, and how did you get in there?
I think it's definitely been easier to talk about violence against women since Elon Musk took over Twitter and it became X, and lots of people just don't use it anymore. The internet's less terrifying than it used to be. And one of the worst things about doing my job and talking about the things I do is the rape threats, the death threats, the horrible comments, the denial of my professional experience and expertise. So it's like, I miss sometimes where you just got to be like, I've sorted myself, and I'm a Gryffindor, and this is my Patronus, and the happy days of online before J.K. Rowling and was on Twitter kind of going, this is your Patronus, and not all the other stuff she was doing. And I miss old Twitter sometimes, but as a feminist, I'm like, oh, thank God. Thank God there's just like 5 angry people left in the corner of the world somewhere just yelling at each other, and nobody else is realistic. Because that is the hardest bit of this job, I think, is people don't want to hear what you have to say, or what you have to say makes people very angry or very upset or very defensive or very triggered. And in terms of how I got to working with them, it was when I was writing The Places I Cried in Public. My publicist was like, Holly really understands this, and you've got this new service, and then we kind of had meetings. And I am an ambassador, so I don't do frontline work anymore because I realised I kind of had done my time and I couldn't do that. But I go into schools and I talk to young people about healthy relationships. I offer training to teachers and librarians and sex educators about how to use fiction to educate young people about relationships. Because, like, for example, Twilight, people still read that book. It's still really well read, and it's a blueprint of an abusive relationship. So, you know, you can go look at what happens to Bella with Edward Cullen and how she does actually end up dead by the end of those books, but it's romantic somehow because she, you know, it's and so that, so I'm kind of on the education grassroots side, which is something I can do and not feel like my hair's falling out and I want to cry every day.
Just following on, so you've done a lot of work with schools, especially with your young adult novels. But what made you transition to doing your first adult, book for adults?
My book for adults. I think it was just the story came to me. Again, I was getting emotionally triggered by life, so I wrote a book about it. But I was turning 30, and I was just at that. I mean, most of you probably have this to come, but it just becomes this weird thing where every weekend you're over a hen do or a wedding, and everyone suddenly gets married, and everyone suddenly is buying a house, and everybody's having a baby, and it's really like, what? This is happening to us? It's like, I found it a real shock. And 30 as an age is a really weird age to be and to become, because you're like, hang on, I thought I would have had all this stuff. And I just had this idea for a story, which was my adult debut, How Do You Like Me Now, which was like an influencer who's written a best-selling memoir about how awful your 20s are, and everyone like worships her, and now she's 30 and she's seen to be very successful. She's got this best-selling book, she's got this lovely boyfriend, she's got this lovely flat, and she has to look successful because that's what her job is, and like underneath she's a complete wreck and her relationship's in a very bad place. And that's just the idea just came to me, and I was like, well, I can't make this for teenagers. I don't think they want to read about being 30. And so I wrote an adult book, and writing an adult book is much the same as writing a book for teenagers, in that you're alone in your pajamas hallucinating, and it takes a very long time, and it's very demoralising and hard, but you just get to swear a lot more. And you get taken a bit more seriously if you write for adults, which I found really annoying. Lots of people, when I was writing just for teenagers, would be like, well, when are you going to write a proper book? Or if and I was like, have you met teenagers? Have you tried to make them read? It's really hard. And also I find it really frustrating because I think most of us, if we are readers and we love reading, and you'll say, well, what's your favourite book? It's almost always a book that you read as a teenager. Like, teenagers imprint on books, and I think you can change a teenager's life with a book. I just think it's so much more magical and powerful to write for a teenager than it is for an adult. Also, there's no way of marketing to them. They're really hard people to get to read, so it's like a real achievement if a teenager reads a book. I'm like, how did you even know about it? Because no marketing works on you. And what's been so amazing, like you inviting me here tonight, is then they grow up. They become amazing women at Cambridge, and because I've been writing YA for so long, my readers have grown up and they're now like these kick-ass women inviting me to stuff, and that's just such an incredible experience. So writing adult fiction is fun and you get taken more seriously, but writing for teenagers is just in my bones and in my soul, and I love it so much, and I don't think I'll ever stop.
Please don't. So you said writing can be quite demoralising, but what gets you through that process? Is there music? Is there the people around you? If you had to give some things that get you through the harder times of writing, what would they be?
I think the most important part of any creation, whether or not that's a novel or a poem or a painting or, I don't know, however you want to be creative, is surrendering to the fact that you're going to mess up that idea, and that's the process, and that's what making art is. And I think there was some meme that went viral where it was my book idea in my head, and it's like a Da Vinci painting of the Last Supper, and it's just beautiful, and it's what my novel actually looks like, and it's just stickmen on words, and that is the truth. And it's knowing it's, yeah, surrendering to that and going, if you're really excited about this idea and you couldn't stop thinking about it to the point where you're starting to write a novel, it's to hold on to that feeling and know that that will translate by the end of it, and you can get enough of the good stuff on there. And again, it is all about editing. So I'm always like, just write fearlessly in your first draft. I don't read back any of my first drafts until I've written the end. I'm in this like constant game of chicken with myself, because I know that if I read back any of my first drafts before I finished them, I'll be like, this is awful. This is, how have I been allowed to do what I do for a living? Like, this is, I want to cry. I'm so embarrassed at how bad I am. And I wouldn't be able to finish the book. Whereas, and the first thing I always do when I've written the end and I sit down and read my novel back for the first time, I'm always like, I suck. This sucks. This is awful. I always go to my husband, my career's over, and he's like, have you just finished a book? And I'm like, no, it's really over this time. This is even worse. He's like, you say this every time. I'm like, no, this really is terrible. And he's like, first drafts are always terrible. He's like, this is like step one. And my dad always tries to explain it to me. It's like, imagine, I don't know, you're trying to make a marble sculpture, and you don't go straight in with the face, do you? Like, the first round is, you're like, okay, my sculptures are going to be a person holding an apple, and it's a very rough shape, and then you go in again and again and again. And yeah, so that helps, just knowing that. And I've done it I've failed spectacularly with 13 novels now. I've ruined a good idea in my head, and I've learned that, you know, people like you really liked my terrible ruined thing to keep going. And another thing that really helps is somebody taught me this really simple technique. It's a bit like the Pomodoro concentration technique. I don't know if any of you guys use that for revision, where you just set a timer for 25 minutes. Whereas this is kind of like a writing sprint, where you have 4 sprints in a day. One's for 20 minutes, one's for 30 minutes, one's for 40 minutes, and one's for an hour. And you have to, all you're allowed to do in those time slots is either write or just look at your manuscript. You're not allowed to go on your phone, you're not allowed to do anything else. And you can do them in any order. So you could start with an hour. I always start on 20 minutes because I'm massively... and you can do them in whatever order. And I don't know who came up with this. Like, an author, Lauren James, recommended it to me, but I think somebody else told her that. But it's amazing. I've told so many people in writing workshops about it, and they've been like, I've just hit my word count within like the first 2 sections. So yeah, that really helps. Just 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, because it's, I think, collectively only 2.5 hours over an entire day. And it's apparently weirdly so much easier to concentrate and get so much done in a short period of time, whereas I ain't got a whole day to write, and you're just like, write a sentence, look out the window, and go online and see what somebody was wearing to the Met Gala, you know, and then delete the sentence. Whereas if I'm like, okay, 20 minutes, go. So those things help.
That's so helpful. I'm just wondering, is there any questions from the audience about anything? Literally, anything you've wanted to ask Holly? Yeah.
What was her utterly flawless? Just her prose?
The critic just commented that you passed that all the words have Scott Fitzgerald used.
Okay, were flawless. I have, I think so much about reading is about taste. And when I go into schools, I always say there's no such thing as bad reading. Just whatever you read, as long as it's making you feel good, do it. Because there's so much neuroscience that backs up that reading for pleasure is really, really good for you. And also really good for society. There's this charity I work with called Empathy Lab, which is all to do with getting young people to realise that reading will build their empathy, because we learn about other humans through story, and we're wired to respond to story. And apparently only 10% of our empathetic nature is genetic. The rest is all learned. So this idea that women are more naturally empathetic than men is complete bull. It's all learned, and you can learn it through reading. So taste, I don't know, some people might find Fitzgerald really boring, I don't. My caveat is sort of saying what I really enjoy about someone other people might not like, and that's fine. I do not tend to enjoy literary fiction because it goes against the training that I've had as a writer, as a journalist. It's all to do with removing any barrier between the reader and the text, and it's really hard to unlearn that. So whenever I'm trying to read a literary novel, I'm just like, hurry up, what's going on? Wait, I don't need to know this much about what the snow looks like on the branch. I'm just a real plot person. However, the author that I'm just like, it's so beautiful, and yet I am so riveted, is Margaret Atwood. I just don't understand how that woman is so talented and so sparse with her use of language, and yet it's so beautiful, and you just really, you're turning the pages, you're trying to find out what happens. She's, if I was going to be the critique to say everything that she does is flawless, her style, I don't know. I don't think you can teach somebody to be that talented, to be able to straddle both the commercial and the literary just so effortlessly. Maybe it takes her a lot of effort, I don't know, but I'm very jealous, which is always a sign that you really like someone's work, right?
Anyone else?
So you mentioned, alluding to the fact that writing could be a lonesome process. You're in your pajamas and loosely. What are some mentors or people along the way in your journey that really helped? And how did you seek out mentors?
I think I've got a lot of friends who are authors as well. And I do think if you want to be a writer, there are usually so many groups that you can join where you can meet other writers. And it is a weird thing to do, as I said, you're just alone writing it, and the level of geekery I have about books I've read and how much I want to talk about them and first-person technique and all this sort of stuff, whereas other people are like, really? Writers want to have those conversations too. So authors that I've met along the way are like, I don't know how I'd survive without them, because publishing is like an industry. It's constant rejection all the time. You always think when you get published, if you get a book published, then you're going to be happy forever because it's such an incredible achievement. And I'm always, don't take it lightly what an achievement it is, but you get loads of rejections before you get published, and then when you are published, it gets rejected for awards, or you get rejected by people who give it a 1-star review on Goodreads and say they burnt it on a fire, or all that sort of stuff. And so you just need other writers, and I think you need writers where you're like at the same place as you. So all my author friends were kind of published around the same time I was, so they've been in the game. So they're as cynical as I am. So it's about finding your people. There's this really incredible community called the London Writers Salon, and you don't have to be in London to use this thing where they do this writing hour. I think it's at 7:00 every morning, where everyone just joins on Zoom on mute and they just all write. And then they have lots of events, and I think they're kind of expanding around the country. And I think people have made so many friends doing that. That seems to be. But I'm sure there's like literary societies, and it's about finding the people that you can geek out with about writing, who love it as much as you. You can't live without those people, because otherwise you do just feel like a weirdo in your pajamas. So definitely other writers, and I've got my agent as well, who I've been with for a million years, and my editor, who I've been with for a million years. They're at the top table for my wedding, with my mum and dad. So they've definitely really helped me, because it's an industry where you get quite battered and bruised all the time. So you need people to help prop you back up again.
Amazing. Any more questions? I think we have time for one more. If not, then I will go. I have a few. I could be here all day, and I'm aware you've got places to be after this. Is there anything in the future that you would really want to write? Like any particular themes that you're thinking of in future, or just would think would make a good book?
So I'm writing a new YA at the moment that I'm very excited about, and it's about social contagions. So the research for that has been so much fun. Although I keep getting scared I'm contaminating myself. And it's, kind of looking at hysteria, and there's these things, and it's really common. It's so much more common than people realise, but it's usually groups of adolescent girls develop some sort of behaviour that then they start catching off each other. So a couple of years ago, a group of cheerleaders in America all started getting Tourette's-like symptoms. In Africa in the 70s, there was an outbreak of hysterical laughing to the point where you couldn't they're almost in a trance. So I'm writing about that at the moment, and there's just something in my head right now. I don't know where it's going to be, but I just read somewhere that, and I don't know if it's scientifically true, and I'm really going to be really sad if it's not, and I'm too scared to like research it in case it's not. But this idea that, you know how our cells are all renewing all the time and we're replicating, apparently within 7 years you've completely self-replicated. Like you're an entirely different, like no cell in your body existed 8 years ago. There was no, and that's just landed in my head. And I'm like, what if you're waiting 7 years to be completely free from something that might have happened to you? Like it didn't actually happen to you because that person literally doesn't exist anymore, but you can still remember it. That's where I've got a long drive home this evening. Like I deliberately drove here rather than getting the train because I was like, I need to have a think, and the M25 is really good for that sort of thing. So I'll just be driving home in the dark tonight thinking about cell renewal. And in 3 years' time, you might see it in a book and be like, I remember her talking about that weird cell thing, and it's actually not scientifically true, but she's ignored it. So that's where I'm at.
I'll be waiting in Waterstones when that book gets published on the dot.
Yeah.
My last question, just before we run out of time, is what's the biggest thing you want people to take away from your career? Or what's the biggest thing that you want your career to champion? Quite tough.
My life's work, if you can say those words without sounding like a complete knob, is I want people to realise that reading is one of the most powerful forms of activism. And there's so much science to back that up. And that's why I try so hard to be like, there's no such thing as bad reading. Because there's still nothing like a novel in that immersive, empathetic experience. You're feeling what it feels like to be in an abusive relationship, or you're feeling like it is to be a refugee, or you're feeling what it is to fall in love. And your body actually responds when you're reading a novel like you're falling in love, or like you're fearing for your life, or like you're being completely traumatized. And yeah, I'm really trying to push just how much books can change us and make us better people. And if you're kind of like, I want to make the world a better place, how reading might seem a bit less dramatic, but is actually a really good place to start, and how I just wish we could promote the power of narrative a bit more in how much we can really shape people and make them feel better about themselves and make them feel better about others. That's sort of what I hope people say about me if I get hit by a car on the way home, is like, Holly Bourne wrote books that made me understand the world better, and I feel like I'm a better person because I read them, and that's activism. But hopefully you're having a nice time eating some crisps tucked up in your bed whilst you're reading, it's an enjoyable way to make the world a better place as well. So that's what I hope.
Amazing. I'm just going to touch wood that you don't get hit by a car on the way home.
I know. That'd be, too dramatic.
Thank you so much for being here today. It's been an
you.
absolute honour to have you, to host you, and speak with you. You've been so warm and friendly and very engaging, and it's been a great conversation. I hope everyone here has
Thank you for coming when I know you all have exams. I know you probably had to study all day, so thank you for coming, even though I know it's a crazy time of year.
Can we all say thank you to Holly one last time?